Hello, and welcome. It is time to let the day and all of its concerns simply fade away. Find your most comfortable position and gently close your eyes. Let's begin with a single, slow breath. Breathe in deeply. And as you breathe out, feel the tension begin to leave your body. There is nothing else you need to do tonight. Nothing to focus on, and nothing to remember. The story I am about to tell is just a quiet murmur in the background, a calm and steady presence. Tonight, we will travel back to the Roman Empire to hear the story of a man who fought an enemy that never slept. So just relax and allow the sound of my voice to accompany you as you drift towards a deep and peaceful sleep. The terrifying job of the Vigiles, Rome's first firefighters. Our story begins in the year 60 CE. Under the reign of the Emperor Nero, it is a time of immense power and prosperity for Rome. An empire whose tendrils stretch from the misty shores of Britannia to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt. The city of Rome itself is the heart of this empire. A metropolis of over 1 million souls, a breathtaking monument of marble temples, vast forums, and opulent villas. It is the city of poets and philosophers, of triumphant generals and powerful senators. But beneath the veneer of marble and gold, there is another Rome, a city of wood, city of cloth, of oil, of tightly packed tenements and narrow, winding streets. A city that lives in constant mortal fear of a single careless spark. This is the city known to the men of the Vigiles Urbani, the sentinels of the city. This is the city that Gaius Sertorius Macer has just entered. At 19 years old, he is a young man shaped by the sun and soil of a small farm in Umbria. His world has, until now, been one of open fields, rolling hills, and the predictable rhythm of the seasons. But a poor harvest and the allure of a steady wage have pushed him from the familiar world of his home towards the great, intimidating magnet of Rome. Joining the Vigiles was a practical decision. It offered a regular salary, a place to live, and most importantly for a provincial non-citizen like himself, the promise of full Roman citizenship after 25 years of service. It was a long road, but it was a path to a better life, a chance to become someone. His induction is a brief, impersonal affair. He is assigned to the 4th cohort, responsible for the districts that include the Celian Hill and the infamous Subira. His new home is the cohort's barracks, or excubatorium, a large, functional building that feels more like a prison than a home. He is given a rough woolen tunic, a pair of sturdy sandals, and a heavy cloak. He is now a tyro, a recruit, the lowest rung on a very tall ladder. The barracks are loud, crowded, and smell of sweat, leather, and cheap wine. Is surrounded by hundreds of other men, a rough mix of freedmen and fellow provincials from every corner of the empire, Gauls with braided hair, wiry Spaniards, quiet Thracians. They are not the disciplined legionaries of the army. They are a rougher, more pragmatic breed of men, drawn to this dangerous work by necessity rather than glory. Gaius's first few days are a blur of basic training. He learns how to handle an axe, how to form a bucket line, and how to march in formation through crowded streets. But no training can prepare him for the reality of his first night patrol. As dusk settles over Rome, a horn blast signals the start of the Vigilia, the night watch. Gaius joins his century, a group of about 80 men, as they march out of the barracks and into the darkening city. The centurion, a grizzled veteran named Lucius Vorenus, eyes him with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Stick close, Tyro," Varenus grunts, "and keep your eyes open. The fires are the least of your worries in this city at night." The Rome that Gaius had seen by Dea, bustling, chaotic, but magnificent city transforms into something else entirely after dark. Most of the city is plunged into an oppressive blackness, broken only by the flickering oil lamps in the windows of the wealthy or the smoky torches outside a tavern. The Vigiles are the only official presence in this darkness. Their job is to patrol the streets, watching for two things. The first, telltale glow of a fire, and the second, the ever-present threat of crime. The patrol begins in the grander avenues but soon turns into the labyrinthian alleys of the Subura, the district his cohort is responsible for. Here the darkness is absolute. The towering insulae lean in on each other, blocking out the faint light from the moon and stars. The streets are narrow, uneven, and slick with filth. The air is thick with the smell of sewage and refuse. The only light comes from the lanterns carried by the Vigiles themselves, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows that seem to hide 1,000 threats. The silence of the countryside is a distant memory. The Roman night is a cacophony of hidden sounds. From the open windows above come the sounds of arguments, of weeping, of drunken revelry. Dogs bark in hidden courtyards. In the darkness ahead, there are furtive whispers and the scuttling sounds of people or things moving in the shadows. Gaius feels a primal fear, a feeling of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. The other men in his patrol are tense, their hands resting on the hilts of the short swords they carry for self-defense. They are the law here, but it is a law that feels fragile and unwelcome. As they pass a rowdy tavern, men spill out, their faces illuminated for a moment by the tavern's torchlight, their eyes full of hostility. Rah! A rock is thrown from a rooftop, clattering harmlessly on the cobblestones nearby, but the message is clear. They are not universally seen as protectors. To too many of these suburbs' inhabitants, they are just another arm of a state that cares little for them, a gang in uniform. An hour into the patrol, they come across a brawl. Two men are fighting savagely over a gambling debt, knives glinting in the lantern light. Varenus gives a sharp order, and the Vigiles move in, their training taking over. They use their wooden staves to separate the men, a flurry of swift, brutal efficiency. One of the fighters spits a curse at Gaius, his eyes burning with hatred. This is the other face of their job. They are the Triumviri Nocturni, the masters of the night. And their duty is to impose a fragile order on the city's nocturnal chaos. Gaius is overwhelmed. He is a farm boy, used to the simple conflicts of nature. Here, the dangers are human, unpredictable, and filled with a malice he has never encountered. He begins to understand the centurion's warning. The job is not just about water and ladders. It is about navigating a dark, violent world that operates by its own savage rules. As he marches on through the oppressive darkness, clutching his lantern like a talisman, he feels a profound sense of isolation. He is a tiny, insignificant sentinel, standing watch over a city that feels like a sleeping monster. A beast that could awaken at any moment in a torrent of flame or a flash of steel. Weeks turned into months, and the nightly patrols became a grueling routine for Gaius. The initial heart-pounding fear of the darkness was replaced by a kind of dull, persistent vigilance. He learned to walk the treacherous, unlit streets of the Subura with a practiced, steady step. He learned to distinguish the innocent sounds of the night, the cry of a restless child, the distant clatter of a baker's cart from the sounds of trouble. His senses, once attuned to the rustle of wind in the wheat fields, were now sharp to the scrape of a sandal on stone in a dark alley, or the low murmur of voices where there should be silence. The naive farm boy was being ground down, reshaped by the city into something harder and more wary. The dual role of the Vigiles became starkly clear. They were firefighters in waiting, but they were policemen in practice. Every night they were confronted with the endless, wearying spectrum of human desperation and violence. Brawls outside taverns were a nightly occurrence. A brief, chaotic explosion of shouting and flailing limbs that they would quell with the detached efficiency of men swatting at flies. But other dangers were more insidious. The darkness was a cloak for the city's thieves, the Führers, who ranged from desperate cut-purses to organized gangs of burglars. One night, while patrolling a particularly narrow street lined with workshops, the centurion Vigiles suddenly held up a hand, freezing the patrol in place. In the oppressive silence, Gaius could hear it too, a faint, rhythmic sound of splintering wood. It came from the back alley of a baker's shop. Vigiles gave a series of silent hand signals, dispatching his men with practiced speed to cover both ends of the alley. Gaius's heart began to pound, his hand tightening on the grip of his wooden stave. They moved in, their lanterns held low. The beam of light caught a figure, a man prying at the back door of the bakery with an iron bar. I froze like a startled animal, his eyes wide in the sudden glare. For a moment there was silence, and then the man dropped his tool with a clatter and bolted. Scrambling over a low wall at the back of the alley, the Vigiles gave chase, their sandals slapping on the grimy cobblestones. The pursuit was short and desperate, a frantic scramble through a maze of sleeping tenements. The thief was swift, more familiar with the terrain than they were, and he soon vanished into the endless, unmappable darkness of the Sebra's rooftops. They returned to the baker's door empty-handed. Vigiles inspected the damage and posted 2 men to stand guard until morning. "We didn't catch him," Gaius said, breathing heavily. "We rarely do," Vigiles replied, his voice laced with cynicism. "Our job isn't to catch them, it's to scare them off, and to be a bigger nuisance than the trouble they're trying to cause." "That's all we are out here, Tyro." A nuisance to the darkness. It was a sobering lesson. They were not detectives, had no authority to conduct investigations or interrogate suspects. They were a blunt instrument, a presence designed to maintain a fragile perimeter of order. They could react to crimes they witnessed, but the city's vast criminal underworld operated just beyond the reach of their lantern light, mocking their efforts. Sometimes the darkness fought back. The gangs and criminal fraternities that controlled the Subura S rackets viewed the Vigiles as a rival organization, an intrusion on their territory. One evening, a patrol in a neighboring section was lured into a dead-end alley by a staged cry for help. A dozen thugs armed with clubs and knives emerged from the doorways, trapping the small group of 8 Vigiles. A brutal fight ensued in the enclosed space. The Vigiles were well-trained, but they were outnumbered. By the time reinforcements arrived, attracted by the horn blast of the cornered patrol, 2 Vigiles were dead, and 3 more were gravely wounded. The news spread through the barracks like a chill wind, a stark reminder of the lethal stakes of their nightly work. After that, the tension on the patrols was higher than ever. The men walked with their hands on their swords, their eyes constantly scanning the rooftops and shadowed doorways. Gosh! Every corner turned was a potential ambush. Gaius learned the true meaning of fear, not the hot, panicked fear of a chase, but the cold, gnawing fear of a constant, invisible threat. He was changing. The open, straightforward nature that had been shaped by the countryside was being replaced by a necessary suspicion. He learned to see the city not as a collection of buildings and people, but as a landscape of threats and angles. He found himself becoming harder, quieter, and more cynical, just like Vorenus and the other veterans. He had joined the Vigiles for a steady wage and the promise of a future, but he was paying for it with his own innocence. One night, as their patrol moved through a slightly wealthier street bordering the district, the air itself seemed to change. The usual stench of sewage and refuse was briefly masked by another, sharper smell. It was acrid and hot. Gaius, whose senses were still rooted in the natural world, was the first to notice it. He stopped, lifting his head and sniffing the air like a hunting dog. "What is it, Tyro?" Vorenus asked, annoyed at the halt. "Smoke," Gaius said, his voice quiet. It wasn't the familiar, fragrant smell of a cooking fire or a baker's oven. This was the smell of something unnatural, of things burning that were not meant to burn. The other men sniffed the air and murmured in agreement. Far down the street, almost too faint to see, a barely perceptible orange glow seemed to flicker against the low-hanging clouds. The patrol fell silent, their shared purpose shifting in an instant. The nightly battle against the city's human dangers was over. Their true enemy, the reason for their existence, had finally awakened. The moment Gaius uttered the word smoke, the patrol's dynamic shifted from cautious vigilance to urgent, focused action. The centurion Vorenus took a deep breath, his nostrils flaring. His years on the streets had given him an almost animal sense for the city's dangers. He nodded curtly, his face grim in the lantern light. "It's a true fire," he confirmed, the words carrying a heavy finality, not a charcoal brazier. "Something is feeding it," he barked a series of sharp commands. Two of the youngest, fastest men were dispatched to run back to the barracks, their mission to sound the main alarm and alert the cohort. The rest of the patrol broke into a disciplined, heavy-footed run towards the faint orange glow, which was now visibly pulsing against the dark underbelly of the clouds. The run was short, only a few streets, but with every step, the signs of the fire grew more intense. The smell of smoke became a thick, choking stench of burning wood, cloth, and something else, a sharp chemical temps. Panicked shouting replaced the usual nocturnal sounds of the city. As they rounded the final corner, the full scene burst upon them, a vision of chaos and terror. The fire was on the ground floor of a 5-story insula in a dyer's workshop. Flames, brilliant and orange, roared from the open doorway and shattered windows, licking greedily at the wooden balcony on the floor above. Thick black smoke poured into the street, obscuring the night sky. The scene was one of pure pandemonium. The tenants of the insula were in a state of frantic panic. Figures appeared on the upper floors, screaming for help. People were tossing their meager belongings, chairs, pots, bundles of clothing from the windows, which then rained down on the street below. A tide of frightened residents was trying to flee the building, creating a panicked bottleneck at the main entrance. The heat from the blaze was a physical blow, a wave of energy that could be felt from across the street. Vorenus and his men immediately went to work. They were the first responders, and their primary job was to create order from chaos. "Form a line," Vorenus roared, his voice cutting through the din. "Push them back. Give us room." Using their wooden staves, they created a cordon, a human barrier to hold back the terrified but obstructive residents, clearing a space in front of the burning building. Other members of the patrol located the nearest public fountain, a small trickling source of water, and immediately began to form a bucket brigade, the most ancient and desperate form of firefighting. Just as they began their frantic, almost futile work, the sound of horns and running feet echoed through the streets. The rest of the cohort was arriving. They were a force of disciplined chaos, moving with a speed and purpose that awed the terrified onlookers. Teams of men fanned out, each with a specific task. Gaius, as a tyro, was assigned the most basic and grueling job. He was shoved into the hame, the bucket line. He found himself part of a human chain. Stretching from the fountain to the fire, a leather bucket, heavy with water, was slapped into his hands. He passed it to the man next to him, turned, and another was immediately there. It was mindless, back-breaking labor. Turn, grab, pass, turn, grab, pass. His muscles quickly began to burn, his lungs filled with the acrid smoke. He could feel the intense heat on his face, even from a distance. Through the smoke, he saw the specialists go to work, deploying their rudimentary but vital equipment. A team of brawny Vigiles, the Axeman, advanced on the workshop. They carried heavy bronze-headed axes, the Delabre. With rhythmic, powerful swings, they began to smash down the heavy wooden door of the dyer's shop, the splintering wood sounding like gunshots in the roaring chaos. Other men brought forward the cohort's prized possession, the siphones. These were rudimentary water pumps, large bronze contraptions worked by two long levers. Teams of men furiously worked the handles, their bodies straining in unison. Nozzlemen aimed the spout, and with a great hiss, a sputtering jet of water shot out, arcing weakly towards the flames licking the second-floor balcony. It was not a powerful stream, but it was a continuous one, and it was their best hope of stopping the fire from climbing higher. Another team was busy with the centones. They unfurled heavy woolen blankets and quilts, plunging them into massive vats of water and vinegar that had been hauled on carts from the barracks. The soaked blankets were then used to beat at the edges of the fire, smothering the smaller flames that threatened to spread to the adjacent buildings. The air filled with the sizzle of water hitting hot surfaces and the sharp, tangy smell of the vinegar. A great crash and a roar of flames erupted as the Axeman finally broke through the door. The fire, fed with fresh oxygen, billowed out into the street, forcing everyone back. Now, the bucket brigade's work became critical. Men at the front of the line would run forward, hurl their bucket of water into the blazing interior, and run back, their tunics steaming, their faces scorched. Gaius worked on his mind a numb landscape of pain and effort. His world was the weight of the bucket, the shouting of the men, and the terrifying living presence of the fire. This was his job. This was the enemy. It wasn't a man with a knife in a dark alley. It was an elemental force of destruction. Slowly, agonizingly, their combined efforts began to make a difference. The jet from the siphones soaked the balcony above, preventing its collapse. The relentless assault from the bucket brigade began to quell the heart of the blaze inside the workshop. After what felt like an eternity, the raging roar of the fire subsided into a sullen, angry hiss. The bright orange flames shrank, replaced by a deep red glow and immense clouds of steam and smoke. The fire was contained. It had not spread beyond the workshop, though the business was utterly destroyed, and the floors above were heavily damaged. As the immediate danger passed, the Vigile's adrenaline gave way to sheer exhaustion. Gaius broke from the line, stumbling to a nearby wall, his whole body trembling. He was covered in soot, soaked in a mixture of sweat and spilled water, and his throat was raw from the smoke. He coughed, a deep, rattling cough that brought up black phlegm. He looked at the smoldering ruin, at the blackened faces of the veteran firefighters around him. He had survived his first fire. He now understood the terrifying reality of his profession. This had been a small, easy fire. The thought of what a truly large one would be like planted a seed of cold, profound terror in his heart. The days following Gaius's first fire were a period of sober reflection and education. The visceral, chaotic experience of the battle was now broken down and analyzed by the veteran Vigiles in the relative calm of the barracks. The frantic, terrifying moments were transformed into tactical lessons. For Gaius, the fire had been a roaring, singular monster. For the veterans, it had been a series of problems to be solved with the limited and flawed tools at their disposal. It was in these debriefings, and in watching the men maintain their equipment, that Gaius began to truly understand the nature of his new profession. His education began with the most fundamental element of their work: water. He learned that every cohort had a team of specialists, known as the equerry. These men were not the strongest or the bravest, but they were often the most critical. Their weapon was not an axe, but knowledge. Each Aquarius was a living map of the district, tasked with knowing the precise location of every public fountain, every cistern, and every water basin or castellum aquae that dotted the urban landscape. When an alarm was sounded, while others grabbed their equipment, the equerry would be the first out the door, sprinting ahead to the scene to assess and secure the nearest viable water sources. A veteran explained the grim reality to Gaius as they repaired leaky leather buckets. "Anyone can pass a bucket, Tyro," the old soldier rasped, his hands expertly stitching a seam.
Ow.
But the Aquarius has to think. The fountain nearest the fire might be the smallest. 100 thirsty men in a bucket line can drain it in minutes. Then what? You're running through dark streets, choking on smoke, trying to find another source while the fire grows. A good Aquarius knows which source is biggest, not just which is closest. He knows which ones are fed by the major aqueducts and which are just local cisterns. That knowledge is the difference between a contained fire and a lost city block. Gaius also gained a new respect for the siphones, the bronze water pumps he had seen in action. Back at the barracks, he watched the siphonary. The pump operators meticulously clean and maintain the complex machinery. They were heavy, cumbersome devices, each requiring a cart to be moved through the city. He learned about their inner workings: 2 bronze pistons in cylinders, a series of valves, and a swiveling nozzle. It was an impressive piece of engineering, the pinnacle of their firefighting technology, but its limitations were severe. The same veteran who had lectured him on water pointed to one of the pumps. "She looks impressive, doesn't she? A bronze beast to fight the fire. But she is a thirsty, weak, and stubborn beast." He explained that it took a team of at least 8 strong men to operate one effectively. 2 men on each handle, working in a frantic seesawing rhythm just to build up a pathetic amount of pressure. More men were needed to aim the heavy, unwieldy nozzle. And a dedicated bucket brigade was required just to keep the pump's small reservoir from running dry. And for all that work, the veteran grunted, "What do you get?" He held his hands apart to indicate a small stream, a jet of water that can barely reach the third-story window of an insula. It's good for putting out a fire that's just started on a balcony, or for soaking a roof to keep sparks from catching. But if the fire is inside, if it has truly taken hold of the building, that little stream is like spitting on a funeral pyre. It's useless. This new knowledge cast the previous night's fire in a new light. Gaius now understood that the frantic, seemingly chaotic activity had been a carefully managed, resource-limited operation. The siphones had been used not to extinguish the main blaze, but to prevent it from spreading upwards. The true work of fighting the fire's core had been done by the most primitive tool they had, the bucket. He felt the truth of this in his own body. His shoulders and back ached with a deep, grinding pain from his time in the Heme. The bucket brigade was the heart and soul of their work. It was inefficient, exhausting, and heartbreakingly slow. For every 10 buckets of water that left the fountain, half was lost to spillage on the frantic journey down the line. But it was their foundation. It was the brute force application of manpower against an elemental force. It was a testament to the idea that enough determined men working together could overcome even the most fearsome enemy. As the week wore on, Gaius saw that this philosophy applied to every aspect of their work. Every tool, from the leather buckets to the bronze pumps, was merely a supplement to the strength and courage of the men who wielded them. Their true resource was their own bodies, their willingness to endure the heat, the smoke, and the exhaustion. One afternoon, as he was sharpening a new handle for an axe Varinus, the centurion stopped to inspect his work. "You did well in the fire, Tyro," he said, a rare compliment. "You didn't panic. You kept the line moving." Gaius nodded, unsure what to say. Varinus picked up a different tool, a massive iron hook attached to a long wooden pole. "You understand now that buckets and pumps are weak weapons. You know that our real fight is with water, finding it and using it before it runs out." He rested the heavy hook on the ground. "Now you must learn the final lesson. You must learn what we do when the water fails, or when the fire is too large to be quenched. When we can no longer fight it, we must starve it." He tapped the iron hook. "When water's not enough, our best tools are the axe, the pole, and the hook. Our best weapon is demolition." Gaius did not have to wait long to see the grim lesson of demolition put into practice. A few weeks later, an alarm horn blared through the barracks in the middle of the afternoon, a rare and ominous sign. A daytime fire meant a fire in the heart of the city's commercial hustle, ablaze with endless fuel and endless potential for chaos. The fourth cohort was mobilized in minutes, their heavy-booted sandals pounding the stone streets as they raced towards the Vicus Tuscus, a bustling street near the Forum known for its shops and warehouses. Smoke was visible long before they arrived, a thick, greasy black pillar climbing into the otherwise clear blue sky. The fire had started in a warehouse storing olive oil. The result was an inferno of unimaginable ferocity. The building was already a complete loss. A roaring furnace that was spewing flames and burning debris onto the neighboring structures. A 6-story insula, its flimsy wooden structure and balconies bone dry from the summer heat, had already caught fire. The blaze was spreading with a terrifying, unnatural speed, leaping from one wooden beam to the next, devouring the building from the inside out. The cohort's initial response was swift but futile. Siphones were deployed, their weak streams of water turning to steam and vaporizing long before they could reach the heart of the flames. The bucket brigades were a pathetic gesture against such a conflagration. The heat was so intense that it drove the men back, scorching their skin and making it impossible to get close. They could only watch as the fire, now completely out of control, began to threaten the next insula in the tightly packed row. Centurion Varenus, his face grim and already slick with sweat and soot, wasted no more time on the impossible. "The water is useless," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "Starve the beast. Demolition teams, forward. We create a fire break here." A wave of disciplined action rippled through the cohort. This was the moment the true nature of their work was revealed. Specialized team of the largest and most experienced Vigiles, men built like oxen, pushed to the front. They carried the brutal tools of their trade, massive, long-handled sledgehammers called melee, and the fearsome falses, iron hooks as large as a man's arm, mounted on immensely long wooden poles. Their target was not the burning insula, but the next one in line. A slightly smaller tenement whose occupants were now frantically trying to escape. The sheer terror of the strategy became clear to Gaius. To stop the fire, they had to preemptively destroy the homes and property of citizens who were, for the moment, untouched by the flames. The tenants screamed in protest, trying to argue, to plead, but they were ruthlessly pushed back by the other Vigiles. There was no time for debate. The demolition team moved with a focused, violent energy. They got perilously close to the burning building. Shielded from the worst of the heat by vinegar-soaked centones held up by their comrades. They planted the bases of the long poles on the street and, with a great coordinated heave, swung the massive hooks up towards the roof of the target building. The iron hook caught on the wooden eaves with a tremendous crash. Ropes were attached to the pole, and dozens of men, Gaius among them, were ordered to pull. "Heave?" Varenus roared, his voice straining with the effort. Gaius leaned back, the rough rope biting into his hands, his sandals scrabbling for purchase on the uneven stones. He was part of a human engine, pulling alongside 50 other men, their muscles straining in a desperate tug-of-war with the building. The heat of the fire next to them was a physical presence, scorching the side of his face. He could hear the timbers of the building groaning, the sound of a living thing in its death throes. While they pulled, the axemen rushed forward in a daring, almost suicidal assault. They ignored the main structure and focused their powerful blows on the building's main vertical supports at the ground level. Chips of wood and plaster flew with every impact. It was a race. Could they weaken the foundation before the men on the ropes could pull the top down? For long moments nothing happened. The building seemed to resist, groaning and creaking, but holding fast. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, a huge section of the roof tore free. A cascade of timber and terracotta tiles crashing down into the street with a deafening roar. A massive cloud of dust and splintered wood erupted, momentarily obscuring the scene. The fire next door roared its approval, a wave of superheated air washing over them. The partial collapse was the breaking point. The axemen had done their work. With another coordinated pull from the rope teams, the entire front of the building began to sag. It seemed to hang there for an impossible second, and then, with a final, grinding shriek of tortured wood, it imploded. Collapsing in on itself in a catastrophic avalanche of debris, the result was a ruin, a mountain of shattered timber, broken pottery, and the sad exposed remnants of people's homes. But it was a ruin without fire. They had done it. They had created a gap, a fire break. When the inferno from the neighboring building reached the newly created void, it found nothing to consume. Robbed of its fuel, the great beast roared in frustration, its flames clawing at the empty air before slowly beginning to recede. Gaius stood, gasping for breath, his body trembling with adrenaline and exertion. He looked at the mountain of rubble they had created, at the weeping families who had just watched their homes be deliberately destroyed. They weren't cheering for the Vigiles. They were screaming curses, shaking their fists in impotent rage. He now understood Varenus's lesson completely. They were not simply saviors. They were agents of brutal, necessary destruction. To save the city, they first had to tear it down. It was a terrifying calculus of loss, and standing in the heat and the smoke, amidst the ruins of a home he had just helped to destroy, Gaius felt the full, thankless weight of his terrifying job. The firebreak held. The great conflagration, robbed of its path forward, consumed the last of the insula it had captured, and began, slowly and sullenly, to die down. But the job of the Vigiles was far from over. The immediate threat of a district-wide disaster had been averted. But the burning building was now a volatile, treacherous death trap, and a new, more urgent phase of their work was beginning. Search and rescue. Panicked cries from the street confirmed that a family on the 4th floor had not been seen escaping. They were presumed trapped, caught on an upper floor by the fire's rapid ascent. Centurion Varenus's face, a mask of soot and grim determination, needed a small, fast team to enter the dying beast and attempt a rescue. It was a volunteer-only task, the most dangerous work the Vigiles undertook. To Gaius's own surprise, he heard his own voice call out, joining those of a half-dozen other veterans. The near miss with demolition had filled him with a strange, fatalistic courage. "Stay with me, Tyro," Varenus growled, giving him a hard look. "Do exactly as I say. Touch nothing and listen. The fire is loud, but the building speaks its own language. You have to listen for its last words." Equipped with axes and water-soaked centonis to use as shields against the heat and falling embers, the small team plunged into the main entrance of the ruined building. The change from the open street to the interior was instantaneous and horrifying. The roar of the fire was now a muffled, oppressive presence, a constant, deep thrum that seemed to vibrate in the bones. The heat was a solid wall, so intense it was difficult to breathe. But the greatest enemy was the smoke. It was a thick, black, and utterly blinding fog, filled with toxic fumes from burning paint, cloth, and wood. Visibility was reduced to an arm's length. The only light came from the dull, angry red glow of the embers that pulsed from the rooms around them. They made their way towards the staircase, a treacherous structure of stone and wood that was miraculously still standing, though it groaned and shifted under their weight. They moved slowly, Varenus in the lead, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The air was filled with the constant, unnerving sound of the building's agony, the sharp crackle of burning timbers, the hiss of water from the siphones outside, finding hot stone, and, most terrifyingly, the deep groaning sound of the structure settling, a prelude to collapse. They reached the 3rd floor landing, the heat growing more intense with every step upwards. The smoke was thicker here, stinging their eyes and catching in their throats, causing them to cough in ragged, painful gasps. Gaius felt a rising sense of claustrophobic panic. This wasn't a battle in an open street. This was a descent into a hellish, enclosed tomb. They were about to start up the next flight of stairs when Vigiles suddenly stopped. He held up a hand, his head cocked, listening intently to something Gaius couldn't hear over the roar. Gaius took another step forward, his foot just about to land on the first step of the next flight. "Back!" Vigiles screamed, his voice a raw, primal sound of pure alarm.
Ow.
The centurion lunged, grabbing the front of Gaius's tunic with one powerful hand and hurling him backward with a force that sent him stumbling into the men behind him. Gaius landed in a heap on the landing as a sound like the cracking of a giant S-bones echoed from above. A second later, the entire staircase they had been about to climb, along with a huge section of the fourth-floor landing, collapsed in a thundering avalanche of stone, timber, and a shower of brilliant orange sparks. The space where Gaius had been about to step was now a gaping, fiery maw, leading down into the heart of the blaze on the lower floors. Gaius lay on the floor, stunned and trembling, the roar of the collapse echoing in his ears. Dust and smoke filled the air, making it impossible to see or breathe. A burning beam lay just a few feet from him, its heat scorching his tunic. He had been a single footstep away from a horrific death. He owed his life to the centurion's impossible instinct, to his ability to hear the building's last words. Vigiles crawled over to him, his face a demonic mask in the glowing darkness. "I told you to listen, Tyro," he rasped, his voice a mixture of fury and relief. He hauled Gaius to his feet. "Never trust a floor. Never trust a wall. In a fire, everything is your enemy." The rescue was a failure. There was no way to reach the fourth floor now. The team retreated from the unstable structure, battered, bruised, and defeated. They emerged back into the open air, gasping for breath, their forms black against the afternoon sky. Back in the relative safety of the street, as the cohort worked to dampen the last of the smoldering embers, Vigiles came over to Gaius. He said nothing, but simply placed a heavy hand on his shoulder and squeezed, a gesture of acknowledgement and acceptance. In that moment, Gaius understood the true nature of the Vigiles. They were not just a cohort of men. They were a brotherhood. Their survival depended not on their faulty equipment or their meager wages, but on each other. It depended on the hard-won, almost supernatural instincts of veterans like Vigiles, and the willingness of recruits like himself to trust those instincts with their lives. He had faced the fire, he had faced demolition, and now he had faced the treachery of the building itself. He had survived, and in doing so, had earned his place. In the aftermath of the warehouse fire, Gaius had expected a sense of victory, or at least grim satisfaction. They had faced an inferno, performed a dangerous and destructive task, and had successfully stopped its spread. They had, by the brutal calculus of their profession, saved the district. But as they stood, exhausted and soot-stained in the ruined street, there were no words of thanks from the citizens they had protected. Instead, they were met with a wave of raw, unfiltered fury. The family whose insula they had demolished stood amidst the rubble of their former lives, their faces contorted with grief and rage. The mother, a woman with wild, unkempt hair, screamed curses at them, calling them destroyers and vultures. The father threw a stone that glanced off a veteran's leather helmet. They were not seen as saviors. They were seen as the agents of ruin. To that family, there was no difference between the fire that had destroyed their neighbor's home and the men who had destroyed theirs. The end result was the same. They were homeless. This was a new, bewildering lesson for Gaius. He had learned to fight the fire, to navigate the dangers of the city's darkness, and to trust the men beside him. He had not been prepared for the open hostility of the public. He had joined the Vigiles with a simple, noble idea of protecting people. The reality was far more complicated. In the weeks that followed, he learned that this animosity was not an exception. It was the norm. The relationship between the Vigiles and the citizens of Rome was a fraught and deeply mistrustful one. They were often blamed for arriving too late. A fire could take hold with shocking speed, and the time it took to receive an alarm, mobilize a cohort, and navigate the tortuously narrow and crowded streets could mean the difference between a small blaze and a lost building. More than once, they arrived at a scene to find the owner of a burning workshop or home frantically trying to fight the blaze himself, only to turn his rage on the Vigiles, accusing them of laziness or incompetence, as they pushed him aside to do their work. The thanks they received was often a shower of insults. The practice of demolition, while their most effective tool, was also the greatest source of resentment. The Vigiles operated under a simple, brutal authority. They could destroy any property necessary to halt the spread of a conflagration. The owners received no compensation from the state. Their life's work, their family home, could be leveled in a matter of minutes by a centurion's order, and they had no recourse. To the man whose home was torn down, the Vigiles were not heroes. They were state-sanctioned destroyers who had ruined him to save a wealthier neighbor. This suspicion ran deeper than simple anger. It was rooted in a history of corruption and a deep-seated Roman cynicism about power and money. One evening in the barracks, Gaius listened as Vorenus and some other veterans spoke of the old days. Before the time of the Emperor Augustus and the founding of the Vigiles, they spoke of Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in the late Republic. Crassus made a good portion of his fortune from fires, Vorenus explained, his voice low. He had his own private fire brigade, hundreds of slaves trained with buckets and ladders. When a building caught fire, his men would rush to the scene, but they wouldn't fight the fire, not at first. He paused, letting the story sink in. First, Crassus's agents would find the panicked, weeping owner and offer to buy the burning building from him for a ridiculously low price. They'd make offers on the threatened buildings next to it, too. If the owners, in their desperation, agreed to sell, the brigade would get to work. If they refused, the brigade would stand by and watch it all burn to the ground. The story, whether entirely true or an exaggerated legend, perfectly captured the public's deep-seated suspicion. They believed that fire was often a tool for the rich and powerful, a way to clear land and acquire property cheaply. This cynicism tainted their view of the Vigiles. When a fire broke out, especially in a poorer district coveted by property developers, the locals would watch the Vigiles with narrowed, suspicious eyes. Were they truly there to help, or were they working in the interests of some wealthy speculator? Rumors would fly through the crowd. The fire had been started deliberately. The Vigiles were intentionally letting it burn to clear the way for a new villa. Gaius experienced this firsthand during a fire in a tenement that bordered a wealthy senator's estate. As they fought the blaze, he saw the senator standing on his balcony watching the events with a calm, almost serene detachment. The other Vigiles noticed it too, and the whispers started among them. "He's wanted this land for years," one man muttered. "Ay, genient, isn't it?" This pervasive atmosphere of distrust was corrosive. It ate away at the sense of purpose that a man needed to risk his life for strangers. Gaius learned to wear a mask of hardened indifference, to ignore the curses, the accusations, and the thrown stones. He learned that his duty was not to be loved, but to be effective. But the knowledge was a heavy weight. He was an agent of an imperfect, often distrusted system. He risked his life daily for a city that, more often than not, seemed to hate him for it. His simple desire to be a protector was now a complex, thankless burden. As he walked his nightly patrols, he no longer saw citizens as people to be saved, but as a volatile, unpredictable element, as dangerous in their own way as the fires he had sworn to fight. As Gaius became a more seasoned member of the fourth cohort, the chaotic and often hostile world of the streets began to resolve into a more structured reality. He started to understand that he was not just a part of a random gang of watchmen, but a small cog in a vast and complex machine, an organization with its own logic, hierarchy, and geography. This understanding didn't lessen the danger of his work, but it framed it within a larger, citywide context that was both impressive and daunting. His education in the system began with the city itself. A veteran Aquarius showed him a map etched onto a stone tablet in the barracks. On it, Rome was divided into 14 distinct administrative regions, the regiones. This was the foundational map of their lives, a system established by the Emperor Augustus decades earlier to bring order to the sprawling, chaotic metropolis. The city is too big for any one man or any one cohort to know, the old specialist explained, so Augustus cut the beast into 14 pieces. We are only responsible for our 2. Gaius learned that the Vigiles consisted of 7 cohorts in total, with each cohort assigned to protect 2 of the 14 regions. The 4th cohort, his cohort, was responsible for Regio 2, Calamantium, a district of rolling hills and the great houses of the wealthy, and Regio 4, Templum Passus, which included the notorious Subora and the crowded, noisy markets near the Forum. The contrast was stark. Their duties swung from protecting the sprawling, stone-built villas of senators to fighting fires in the flammable, tinderbox tenements of the poorest of the poor. Within this structure, he began to understand the chain of command. He and the hundreds of men like him were the foundation. They were the moonlights, the common soldiers of the cohort. Their lives were governed by their immediate superior, the centurion. Men like Vorenus were the backbone of the Vigiles. They were the seasoned professionals, often promoted from the ranks after decades of service. The centurion was the absolute authority on the streets. It was his experience that identified the sound of a collapsing roof, his voice that gave the order to demolish a home, his discipline that held the line in a riot. Above the centurions was the tribune, the commander of the entire cohort of roughly 1,000 men. The tribune was usually a man of the equestrian class, a knight, for whom this was a stepping stone in a larger administrative or military career. He was a remote figure to Gaius, a man seen only during formal inspections or from a distance at the main barracks. He was the administrator, the link between the cohort and the powers that ran the city. At the very top of the pyramid was a man whose name was spoken with a mixture of awe and fear, the Prefectus Vigilum, the prefect of the watch. The prefect was one of the most powerful men in Rome. Appointed directly by the emperor, he was the supreme commander of all 7 cohorts, a force of 7,000 men. He was a judge with his own court, able to try thieves and burglars caught in the night. He was in effect the nocturnal governor of Rome, responsible for everything that happened in the city from dusk until dawn. The prefect's orders could deploy entire cohorts, seal off districts, and make decisions that affected the lives of tens of thousands. To Gaius, he was an almost mythical figure, the unseen general in their nightly war. This vast organization was housed not just in the 7 main barracks, but in a network of smaller watchposts, or excubatoria, scattered throughout the city. Gaius's nightly patrols no longer felt like a random wandering through the dark. He now understood they were a deliberate, calculated sweep of a specific sector, operating from a local watchpost. These smaller stations allowed for much faster response times. A fire could be spotted and a first response initiated by the men at a local excubatorium long before the main cohort could be mobilized from the barracks. This new knowledge changed Gaius's perspective. He was still risking his life for a city that often seemed to despise him, but he now saw his role as part of a grand, organized strategy. He was a sentinel, part of an intricate web of patrols and watchposts that formed a shield over the sleeping city. It was a thin, often ineffective shield, but it was a shield nonetheless. The system was flawed, the equipment was poor, and the public was hostile. But the structure itself was a monumental achievement. It was a testament to the Roman genius for organization, an attempt to impose order on a fundamentally chaotic world. As he stood his watch on the roof of a small watchpost one night, looking out over the endless sea of darkened rooftops, he felt a strange sense of belonging. He was no longer just a farm boy from Umbria. He was a soldier of the 4th cohort, a guardian of Regio 4, a vital piece of the great, sprawling, and deeply flawed machine designed to keep Rome from devouring itself. Gaius's understanding of the Vigile's complex role was solidified during a call that took him far from the familiar dangers of the Suburra. The alarm sounded late one night, not for a tenement in their usual district, but for a blaze in Regio 2, Calimontium. This was the other half of the 4th cohort's responsibility, the Celian Hill, a fashionable neighborhood of sprawling private homes or domos, belonging to senators and wealthy equestrians. As they marched up the wide, clean avenues of the hill, the difference was immediately apparent. The air was cleaner, the streets were wider, and the oppressive darkness of the lower city was held at bay by the light spilling from the many-windowed opulent residences. The fire was at the home of a wealthy merchant. From the outside, the situation looked dire. Smoke was billowing from the roof of the main wing of the house, and a section of the upper story was glowing with an intense orange light. Yet the atmosphere was entirely different from the panicked chaos of a fire in the Suburra. There was no screaming mob, no rain of thrown belongings. Instead, a small, well-dressed crowd of household slaves and concerned neighbors stood at a respectable distance, watching in anxious silence. The owner of the domus, a portly man in an expensive sleeping gown, met them at the gate. He was not screaming curses. He was shouting frantic, contradictory orders. "Save the library!" He bellowed at Varenus, pointing at a wing of the house far from the flames, and the statues in the peristyle. They were imported from Greece. Be careful with the mosaics. The Vigiles pushed past him, their faces set in grim professional masks. Gaius, now experienced enough to be part of the first response team, followed Vorenus into the central courtyard of the home. Here, the challenge was immediately different. Unlike the flimsy, timber-framed insulae, this house was built to last. The walls were thick stone and plaster, and the floors were made of tile and concrete. The fire was not consuming the structure itself with the same terrifying speed. Instead, it was feeding on the luxurious contents, expensive wooden furniture, cedarwood paneling, wool and silk wall hangings, and a vast collection of wax scrolls in the study where the blaze had started. This was not a battle of demolition, but one of surgical intervention. The risk of a district-wide conflagration was low, but the pressure from the homeowner was immense. Every item they broke, every door they smashed, was a potential complaint to the prefect. They were not just fighting a fire. They were navigating a minefield of precious and often flammable property. The bucket brigade was formed, but the water source was a decorative marble fountain in the center of the courtyard, and the men were careful not to chip the stonework as the siphones were brought in. Their nozzles directed through the windows with a precision that was impossible in the chaos of a tenement fire. The axeman, instead of brutally smashing down walls, worked to carefully pry open doors and shutters to vent the smoke. Gaius was assigned to a team tasked with salvage. He found himself inside the vast, smoke-filled atrium of the house, working alongside household slaves to drag heavy bronze statues and ivory-inlaid couches out into the safety of the courtyard. The smoke was thick and choking, but it lacked the greasy, toxic quality of the Subura fires. Here the air smelled of burning wealth, of exotic woods and scented oils. He was struck by the absurd contrast of his situation. Risking his life to save objects that were worth more than he would earn in 100 years of service. The owner followed them everywhere, wringing his hands, pointing out which items were most valuable, and complaining about the water damage to his precious floors. He seemed less concerned about the Vigile's safety than about the potential for a scratch on a marble bust. To him, they were not saviors. They were a clumsy but necessary service, hired help to be directed and scolded. After 2 hours of grueling work, the fire was extinguished. It had been contained to the study and the adjoining rooms. The house was saved, though heavily damaged by smoke and water, as the Vigiles gathered their equipment, exhausted and sweat-soaked. The merchant conducted a loud and thorough inventory of the damage, complaining about every scorch mark and broken vase. There was no word of thanks, only a grudging nod before he disappeared inside to berate his slaves. Walking back to the barracks as dawn broke, Gaius felt a new, more nuanced kind of resentment. In the Subura, the people hated them with a raw, desperate passion born of loss. Here among the wealthy, they were met with a calm, entitled arrogance. They were seen not as men, but as tools, functional but disposable. The contempt was quieter, but it was just as profound. He had joined the Vigiles to find a place in the Roman world, but he was learning that whether he was in the poorest slum or the wealthiest estate, his place was always the same. On the outside, a servant to a city that offered him its dangers, but never its respect. Several years passed. Gaius Sertorius Macer was no longer the wide-eyed tyro from Umbria. The city had worked its harsh magic on him, grinding away his rural softness and replacing it with the hardened cynicism and pragmatic competence of a veteran. He had fought dozens of fires, from minor kitchen accidents to multi-story blazes. He had faced down angry mobs, chased thieves through lightless alleys, and witnessed death in its most horrific forms. The job had etched fine lines of wariness around his eyes, but it had also given him an unshakable confidence in his own abilities and in the men of his cohort. He understood the beast, and he knew how to fight it. He thought he had seen all the dangers the city could throw at him. He was wrong. The alarm came in the deepest hour of a hot, dry summer night. It was not the single urgent blast from a local watchpost, but something far more terrifying, a frantic, continuous blaring of horns from the direction of the city center, soon joined by the answering calls from the barracks of other cohorts across the city. It was a sound of citywide panic, a cacophony that signaled a disaster of an entirely different magnitude. The fourth cohort was mobilized in record time, the usual barracks noise replaced by a grim, disciplined urgency. As they marched at a double-quick pace through the sleeping city, the evidence of the fire became apparent long before they reached it. A significant portion of the southern sky was no longer black, but was illuminated by a vast, pulsing, sickly orange glow. Ash, light and gray like morbid snow, began to drift down around them, dusting their helmets and shoulders. Then came the sound, a low, continuous roar, like a distant waterfall, that grew louder with every step. A sound that seemed to make the very air tremble. They were ordered to the commercial district near the Circus Maximus, a chaotic, densely packed area of warehouses, shops, and towering, shoddily built insulae. When they arrived, the scene was one of pure apocalyptic horror. This was not a fire. It was a conflagration. It was not one or two buildings, but an entire city block, and it was spreading with a speed and ferocity that defied belief. The fire had begun in a series of warehouses that stored oil, timber, and textiles, and it had exploded into an unstoppable storm of flame. Gaius, now a veteran himself, felt a cold knot of professional dread that was far worse than the hot panic of his first fires. He could see instantly that this was a battle they were not equipped to win. The heat was a solid physical wall, pushing them back, so intense that it was unbearable even 100 yards away. The wind, generated by the fire itself, was a gale-force furnace, fanning the flames and driving them forward. Immense towers of fire, taller than any temple, writhed into the night sky, consuming entire tenements in a matter of minutes. All the familiar tactics, all the hard-won knowledge were rendered instantly obsolete. The centurions shouted orders, but their voices were lost in the deafening roar. A few teams heroically tried to deploy the siphones, but the machines were like children's toys against this inferno. Their weak streams of water vanished into steam instantly, having no effect whatsoever. The bucket brigades were a suicidal absurdity, and the nearest water basins had already been drained by the first arriving cohorts, or had evaporated from the sheer heat. Gaius looked at the fire and understood. This was not a beast to be fought. It was a force of nature, like an earthquake or a flood. It was no longer just consuming buildings. It was creating its own weather. Terrifying updraft was lifting massive, burning timbers high into the air, carrying them like flaming javelins over the heads of the Vigiles, only for them to crash down hundreds of feet away, starting new fires far from the original blaze. Varenus found Gaius. His face, normally a mask of stoic control, was pale with shock. "There's nothing to be done here," the centurion yelled over the roar. "We're not fighting. We're evacuating. Get the people out. We're pulling back 2 blocks to try and form a break." It was an admission of total, abject defeat. Their job was no longer to extinguish the fire, but simply to try and outrun it. The cohort's mission devolved into a desperate scramble to herd panicked and resisting citizens out of the path of the monster. Gaius found himself no longer a firefighter, but a refugee, part of a tide of humanity fleeing before the advancing wall of flame. He looked at the faces of his comrades, the most hardened veterans of the cohort, and for the first time he saw not grim determination, but pure, unadulterated terror. They were utterly powerless. This was not a fire that had broken out in the city. This was a fire that was going to eat the city alive. The retreat was a desperate, chaotic scramble. Gaius and the rest of the fourth cohort fell back through streets thick with panicked citizens and choking smoke, the roar of the inferno at their backs. Their new defensive line was to be a wide street 2 blocks away, a place chosen not for its tactical advantage, but for its sheer distance from the uncontrollable blaze. Here, the grim, final strategy of the Vigiles was to be deployed on a scale Gaius had never imagined. It was a strategy of total sacrifice. Elements from 3 different cohorts converged on the street, a force of over 1,000 men. The prefect of the Vigiles was there himself, a grim figure on horseback, his fine uniform already stained with soot. His presence confirmed the severity of the situation. This was no longer a cohort-level operation. It was a citywide emergency. The orders relayed down through the tribunes and centurions were simple and brutal. The entire street was to be leveled. Every building, from the grimy tavern on the corner to the 6-story tenement at its center, was to be torn down to create a firebreak wide enough, they hoped, to halt the monster. What followed was not firefighting. It was organized, frantic destruction. Multiple demolition teams, working in tandem, assaulted the buildings. The air filled with the deafening crash of sledgehammers against stone and the splintering shriek of wood being torn apart. Massive hooks were thrown up onto rooftops. And hundreds of men, Gaius among them, pulled on the ropes with a desperate, unified strength. There was no care, no precision. They were not trying to salvage anything. They were simply trying to create a void, a trench of rubble in the path of the fire. They worked with the speed of men possessed. Their movements fueled by adrenaline and the terrifying roar of the approaching fire. The heat was steadily intensifying, and the sky above was now a solid canopy of roiling, orange-tinted smoke. Building after building groaned, sagged, and collapsed into the street, creating a mountain of debris. For over an hour they toiled in this man-made earthquake, a brutal race against the inevitable. Finally it was done. The street was gone, replaced by a wide, impassable scar of rubble and dust. The Vigiles retreated to the far side, a battered, exhausted army taking their position for a final, desperate stand. They stood in silence, watching the end of the next street, waiting for the enemy to appear. The fire arrived like a living entity, a tidal wave of pure flame that poured into the street leading to their firebreak. It consumed the last of the buildings with a triumphant, deafening roar. For a moment, it seemed their horrific sacrifice had worked. The wall of flame reached the edge of the rubble-filled gap and stopped, unable to cross. It lashed out with great tongues of fire, a frustrated beast unable to reach its prey. A ragged, exhausted cheer went up from some of the men. But their victory was an illusion. Tyrannus, standing near Gaius, did not cheer. He was staring at the sky. "The wind," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Look at the wind." Gaius looked up and felt a cold, liquid dread pour into his stomach. The fire's own immense updraft was acting like a volcano, hurling a volcanic storm of burning debris high into the air. Thousands of red and orange sparks, burning embers, and large flaming pieces of wood and roof tile were lifted into the black smoke. Swirling and dancing in the superheated air, they rose higher and higher, caught by the prevailing wind, and were carried effortlessly over the firebreak. It was a rain of fire. The men watched in horror as this deadly shower descended upon the safe zone behind them. A burning ember landed on the dry wooden roof of a tenement 100 feet away. For a moment, it just smoldered. Then, a tiny flame appeared. A second later, another roof began to smoke. Then another. Within minutes, a dozen new fires had erupted behind their defensive line. Their ultimate strategy had failed. The fire had simply flown over their wall. A collective groan of despair rose from the Vigiles. They were now trapped, with the main inferno in front of them, and a new, rapidly growing blaze erupting all around them. The firebreak had not contained the enemy. It had become a cage. Panic began to set in. The disciplined cohorts started to break apart. The organized retreat dissolving into a chaotic scramble for survival. Gaius felt a terror unlike anything he had ever known. He had done everything right. He had followed orders, pulled on the ropes, and helped destroy a street, all in the belief that their methods would work. And it had all been for nothing. He was utterly, completely powerless. He was not a firefighter. He was just a man, and the whole world was catching on fire. Through the chaos, he heard Verena scream a new order, an order he never thought he'd hear. It was not one of strategy, but of survival. Every man for himself, break formation. Fall back to the river, go. There was no more talk of saving the city. There was only the desperate primal instinct to save oneself. Gaius joined the disorganized rout. Running through streets where new fires were now breaking out, the city itself transforming into a hellscape around him. The failure was absolute. The beast could not be fought, it could not be starved. It could only be fled. The fire raged for the rest of the night and much of the following day. It was not fought, it simply consumed. Its advance was finally halted not by the efforts of the Vigiles, but by a combination of shifting winds and the wide-open spaces of the cattle market, the Forum Boreum, where there was less for it to feed upon. The beast, having devoured 3 entire city blocks, finally starved and choked on its own ashes. For Gaius and the other survivors of the cohorts, the night of terror was followed by a day of grim, heartbreaking duty. Once the flames had subsided enough for the ruins to be approached, their role shifted from firefighters to recovery teams. The scene of the blaze was a vast, smoldering wasteland. Entire streets had vanished, replaced by a blackened, alien landscape of charred timbers, collapsed walls, and deep piles of gray ash that still radiated a shimmering heat. The roar of the inferno had been replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence, broken only by the groan of a collapsing wall or the crunch of debris under their sandals. The air was thick with the foul, lingering stench of burnt everything wood, cloth, food, and something else, a sweet cloying odor that the veterans knew all too well. Their new job was to walk through this landscape of ruin and find the dead. It was a slow, methodical, and soul-numbing task. Gaius moved with a team through the skeletal remains of what had once been a crowded tenement, his mind numb, his body moving on pure instinct. They sifted through the ashes and debris, searching for the telltale signs of the lost. The work was grim beyond words, a descent into the quietest, most personal tragedies of the great disaster. They found families huddled together in the final moments, their forms preserved as ghostly outlines in the ash. Gaius felt nothing. The terror of the previous night had burned away every other emotion, leaving behind a hollow, empty core. It was a machine performing a function. The sheer scale of the destruction was too vast for his mind to process. He had seen buildings burn before, but this was different. This was the erasure of a piece of the city. A wound carved into the very heart of Rome. He and his cohort had not just been defeated, they had been rendered utterly irrelevant, tiny figures scurrying before an unstoppable force of nature. Late in the afternoon, their grim work done for the day, Gaius found himself standing with Vigiles on a small, undamaged hill overlooking the devastation. From this vantage point, they could see the full extent of the scar. It was a great black gash, stretching from the edge of the river docks almost to the slope of the Aventin Hill. Beyond it, the rest of Rome stood untouched. The late afternoon sun, glinting on the marble temples of the Forum and the tiled roofs of 1,000 other homes, all of them oblivious to the hell that had unfolded just a short distance away. Gaius, his voice a hoarse, cracked whisper from the smoke, finally spoke. I couldn't imagine anything like this, he said, shaking his head. This has to be the worst fire the city has ever seen. Vigiles did not look at him, continued to gaze out over the smoldering ruins, his eyes looking past them towards the magnificent, untouched heart of the city. He was silent for a long time, the wind gently stirring the soot in his graying hair. No, the centurion said finally, his voice quiet but clear over the silence. This wasn't the worst. This was nothing. He gestured with his chin towards the ruins. This was just a warehouse fire that got lucky with the wind. It started in the wrong place, a place with stone and open space nearby. It was containable eventually. He turned his gaze towards the center of Rome, towards the magnificent clutter of the Palatine Hill and the dense ancient wooden structures around the Circus Maximus. One day, Tyro Vigiles continued, his voice dropping to an almost prophetic whisper. A real fire will come. A fire that starts in the right place, in the old shops by the circus, with a strong summer wind at its back. A fire that will have all the fuel it could ever desire. He looked at Gaius, his eyes holding a deep, ancient weariness. This was a monster, yes, but we slowed it down. We saved who we could. The day will come when a fire starts that we cannot slow. We will not be firefighters then. We will just be more victims. One day, the whole city will burn. Vigiles' words hung in the smoky air, a chilling prophecy. Gaius looked from the devastation below to the great, vulnerable, magnificent city beyond. For the first time he saw Rome not as an eternal, indestructible power, but as a fragile, flammable collection of wood and ambition, waiting for the right spark on the right night. His terrifying job was not just to fight fires, but to stand sentinel against a coming apocalypse that his own commander believed was inevitable. Lucius's long struggle is over now. Story, like so many others, fades back into the quiet dust of history. The great machine of Rome would continue to turn, built on the strength and suffering of millions of forgotten lives. His was the quiet battle, fought not with a sword, but against the crushing weight of a promise he could not keep. His long day is over. And now so is yours. There is nothing left to do but to rest, to let go of the day, and to drift into the deep and peaceful sleep that you deserve.